Welcome to the Fishing Daily podcast, and thank you for joining us again. Now, the issue of highly protected marine areas dominated Scottish fishing this year from spring into the summer. After unyielding pressure from coastal communities and fishing organisations, the Scottish Government gave way on those plans. But the issue of highly protected marine areas has not gone away, something which Cabinet Secretary for Net-Zero Mairi McAllan stated in her speech on the 29th of June, just as Parliament was going for its summer recess. In this podcast, I speak with Sheila from the Shetlands Fishermen's Association and Hannah Fennel from the Orkneys Fisheries Association. Hannah is also the Vice President of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, and we will discuss how their members and communities feel about government's plans and what we should expect to see next. Welcome, Hannah and Sheila.
Hello.
Hiya.
Now, coastal communities in both the Shetland Islands and the Orkney Islands voiced strong opposition to the government's proposals for highly protected marine areas. Now, what was the overall feeling of your members towards these proposals and to the news that the government had decided to withdraw them?
In Shetland, obviously, we have a very strong fishing industry here, a very strong catching industry, and also a farming industry for salmon, which obviously they raised a strong objection to these proposals because they recognise that there's long established traditional industries that would be affected by these, and not just the industries themselves, but the intrinsic values of those industries into our communities could have been devastating. So there's a strong voice raised, and many hundreds of people opposed them through the consultation process. And Shetland fishermen have a proven track record of not being opposed to sensible conservation measures, recognising that fish stocks and healthy marine ecosystems in their best interests as custodians of the sea for that moment in time. Therefore, they recognise that HPMAs was such a blunt instrument in achieving aims that were neither proven they were required or proven that they were effective in achieving the results that was purported to be so. Therefore, there was a very strong voice, and obviously they're really relieved to be in this situation now that the government are rethinking their plans.
Hannah, how is it and for Orkneys, coastal communities?
Yeah, it was very, very similar as to what Sheila was saying in Shetland. I think the main strength of feeling that the members had initially was just shock and obviously a huge amount of concern, because this could overnight have just decimated the entire Orkney fishing industry or Scotland's fishing industry. But I think there was also a lot of frustration as well that once more fishing was being painted as the bad guy and we weren't being seen as part of the solution of climate change by providing low carbon sources of protein and with our huge amount of knowledge about the marine environments. So I think that was really frustrating for us as well.
It doesn't seem to be that the government understands the strain that decisions like this puts on coastal communities, and there seems to be this very dominant talk in Parliament and politics now about protecting people's mental health. But it didn't seem to be that this was taken into consideration by the government and these proposals.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, mental health has been a buzzword over recent years, and the government does seem to be putting a lot of lip service to it, but it is just lip service, because if you look at their actions, that doesn't do anything to support mental health. It's actively undermining it. So the HPMAs was a huge crisis for a lot of fishermen. Many of my members couldn't even sleep. They were wondering about if they would even have a business, a livelihood at the end of 2026. And I think the issue with their mental health went beyond the potential risk to their livelihood, but it was also that once again they were being painted as a villain. So they were sort of being villainized within their own communities as being people that didn't care about the environment and were just being painted as the enemy. And that was really hard for them as well.
And Sheila, it would be the same for people in coastal communities and the Shetlands?
Indeed. I mean, fishermen are no different to anyone else that's running a business. Their external influences on them and affects their daily working lives. Anything that affects their daily working lives causes stresses and strains. And that's more prevalent when they believe these pressures are unwarranted or unnecessary, and particularly when they thought that HPMAs were poorly defined and deeply questionable and based on assumptions that were ideologies rather than scientific evidence or common sense. So our members, we have to, as an organisation that has a membership, need to be alive to what impacts this has on people's mental health and ensure us to look after our members and help the government to better understand what they can set policies many hundreds of miles away from our rural, fragile communities, but they need to understand what the overall effects that has on people's daily working lives and their livelihoods, and whether they're working as an individual, which is lone working is also very stressful in itself, got nobody to talk to, or whether they're working on a larger vessel. They need to ensure that the rural economies and who are putting healthy low carbon food on the tables are not disproportionately affected from policies which have no evidence base.
I think there's definitely something there where, when you have policymakers who are not really connecting with the communities out there. And I was chatting to a fisherman the last day, and he was saying, like, I left school when I was 14 years old. This is all I know. It's something that other people who isn't in that situation can't understand.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and I think we're seeing that more and more. I think that there's an influence on government that we haven't seen before through eNGO groups saying things that are just not true, or making influences on the government which sound nice but don't go beyond a headline. And they don't understand that these are, both Orkney and Shetland are fishing communities, and there are no other jobs for people to turn to. And if you take away a traditional fishing ground, which to them is very abundant and proven to be so, especially in Shetland, where we've got such things as the Shetland Shellfish Management Organisation, where we manage the inside waters around Shetland for shellfish, which is very science-led, and we've got voluntary closed areas, to then put a level of a blanket policy which takes no consideration or cognizance to the existing measures that you're already making within your small community to ensure the livelihoods of fishermen are protected for the future and the environment they're working for, because fishermen, it's in their best interest to have a good, strong biodiversity and good, healthy ecosystem. As I say, they are responsible people that are putting food on people's tables. And it's also proven that if you eat anything different from fish, you're having a stronger carbon footprint. So perhaps the government should recognise that more and protect fishermen and actually stand up for fishermen more, rather than seem to be putting blanket measures which would curtail their activities, full stop.
And Hannah, do you think eNGOs are having too much influence on government policy rather than the science that's been brought by fishermen?
Yeah, I think the way the government approached HPMAs was just far too, it just didn't allow for any conversation or any nuance. And I think that did partly come down to the really strong ideologies that are kind of backing up the government at the moment. And it's this unwillingness to listen as well, which has been really harmful in the policy, in the development of that policy. And I think ultimately why there's been such a strong backlash against it. As Sheila was saying, none of the fishing sectors are opposed to a sensible management or sensible conservation, but that's just not what we were seeing. And I think that really comes down to a lack of understanding of what the fishing sector actually is and how it operates.
Last week, the Shetland Fishermen's Association launched another fishy falsehood paper calling Lamlash Bay an exercise in exaggeration and embellishment. We're seeing more and more scientific reports that were produced based on insecure scientific evidence. How does the fishing industry protect itself from these scientific papers that these eNGOs are relying on?
unfortunately, the fishing industry is regularly subjected to these misleading claims, whether it be in the media, the general public, academia, or even politicians. Therefore, we need to try to debunk some of these myths. Now, we realise that we're never going to be able to stand up to something that's coming from an organisation which is far better resourced than what we are to do that, and have better use of social media channels, etc., and access into the media. But we have to do our part to help to debunk these myths, and that's why the Shetland Fishermen's Association have started doing these fishy falsehoods, covering things from purported messages saying that fish stocks are declining when they're evidently not. ICES has proven that they're not. That's science-backed. And this evidence of Lamlash Bay being a 3 kilometre square area, which then they're trying to exacerbate that up to a 46,000 kilometre area of closure around Scotland, without realising the nuances of the fishing communities and fishing habitats throughout Scotland. It just seems, it's just a bit crazy to jump from a 3 kilometre square area network up to this huge area where the coast varies so much from area to area. And not just the coastline, but the community, the reliance on communities across Scotland as well. The socioeconomic measures from these types of policies are not coming into play, and rather it's coming from a again, as we've said before, an ideology with no scientific base. But then we issued that fishy falsehood on Lamlash Bay, and then we've got information coming back out from the community Arran Seabed Trust, that's coast, they were the area that was around Lamlash Bay, saying that now we're purporting nonsense. But the fact is, and they said that that's not based on scientific, it runs counter to scientific opinion. Well, actually, our Mythbusters they come from scientists, so it's not all scientific opinion, and that's the point. Is many scientists have different viewpoints. In Shetland in the 1970s, the oil came to Shetland, and the community went, we don't want to see our community devastated by the oil industry. So it was set up what was called SOTIAG at that time, which gave a baseline of our environmental status at that time, and then moving on from there to make sure that there was no impacts from oil industry, or that we could understand that. And that's what we need, is an evidence base of research that gives a systematic, long-term and independent monitoring programme to any policy such as this. So that's where we say in Lamlash Bay there was no baseline to then know what the impacts were. And then it's not just within the closed area, it's the impacts out with that closure to the fishing, to understand what's happening. Some of it may well be purported to be good and all the rest of it, but to then exacerbate that up to extrapolate it up to the whole of Scotland just seems irresponsible to me and to many scientists, despite what the Coast Organisation will say.
And Hannah, this one-size-fits-all solution that they're proposing for protected marine areas, that doesn't work, does it?
No, it doesn't. I think it does more harm than good ultimately, and I think we've seen that with the proposed HPMAs. It's undermined a lot of trust in the process and trust in government policy as well. I think it is really important when you're looking at conservation is to be really clear about what it is you're trying to protect. Like what we have with the existing MPA network, you're very clear about what you're trying to protect, and then there's a lot of research about what it's impacted by, and then you can make sure that your conservation measures minimise those impacts. And that's a much more sensible approach than saying banning even angling from the shore for a deep sea coral, which is what would have happened with the HPMA network.
We are seeing a lot of science coming back. Recently, there's another paper that suggests that well-managed areas for under trawling and dredging can actually be sustainable. So we're seeing a lot of kickback and science on other papers. The other paper was that debunked the myth that trawling caused more carbon than airplanes. But we have this knowledge, but still now we seem to find that our green agenda is still relying on this other science that came before it. How do you think we can overcome that? Do you think the government has to really sit down and reconsider this? Or do you think something else needs to be done?
With regard to HPMAs, and against this, I think this fits in for most policy decisions actually taken around fisheries. And there's a bigger problem here when it comes to climate change and biodiversity orientated policies. It's the speed of change that scientists want to see things happening, telling us to act in a very quick manner, leads to this top-down policy, bans, restrictions, drawing lines on maps, and that's what's unpalatable to people, not just fishermen. And I think what we've seen in the press is fishermen are against HPMAs. Actually, whole communities are against HPMAs because they can't see why drawing a line on a map around 10% of the seas around Scotland is either necessary or what they will achieve. We need to stop, think, and work together. The fishing industry needs to be better consulted. Communities need better consulted on these things, and to reshape something that's more workable for communities, rather than this top-down, heavy, unpalatable policy that's coming at us hard, that will devastate communities. I mean, we have this messages that says that, as you said, that trawling is bad, that scallop dredging is bad. We have evidence in Shetland to say that they're sustainable for 60 years in the same fishing grounds, 4% of our inshore waters, that's 4%, so it's 96% of our inshore waters where scallop doesn't happen. It's sustainable, and those stock levels are maintaining the same. So it's when one message is used to, again, over the whole of the Scottish fishing industry, that's what we can't accept, because it's more nuanced than that.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion, or a lot of, again, lip service within the Scottish Government to the concept of a just transition. But when it comes down to it, there's not really any information or any definition of what that means or what that looks like. And I think for any meaningful engagement from government, we really have to know what they're talking about when they say just transition, because they can't just ban or destroy entire sectors and then not offer alternatives to them. And I think that's a big concern for so many people and so many communities.
Before the summer recess, we've seen Mairi McAllan, the Minister for Net Zero, saying that they're backing down from the plans for HPMAs, and they've promised that the next generation of protected marine areas will be designed with more closer consultation with the coastal communities. Has any consultations happened with you since that announcement was made?
In Orkney, we did have Mairi McAllan visit very, very briefly, and she held a round table with the local council, 2 local fishers and the aquaculture sector. However, I wasn't able to attend, but I do believe it was quite brief and quite high level, but she had promised to continue the consultation, that she might be back. But that's really the only engagement that I've had or we've had in Orkney since the announcement of the HPMAs being scrapped.
We're the same. We had a meeting with Mary Goujon before that announcement was made here in Shetland, where they met not just the fishing industry, but salmon farmers and communities as well. And she just said, we're listening, but while our members are relieved to hear that the HPMA proposals that was consulted on has been set aside, they're still very aware that the threat to their livelihoods has not gone away. And we're waiting to hear with bated breath to find out what the government propose next, because we're very alive to the fact that the Bute House Agreement is still there. That's a historic power sharing deal with the SNP that was committed to designate at least 10% of Scottish seas as HPMAs by 2026. That is still there. I think if it had been thrown into long grass and they're really realistically thinking about something else, we had a huge backlash from the Greens. That has not happened. So HPMA's rebranded, called something else, reshaped, is still alive. It's still there. It's not gone away. We're not naive enough to think that the battle is over. We may have won this bit, but the war is still on, if you want to call it that. But we know that the government are now saying, because of the press, they carried it right down to people writing songs about it and appearing in charts saying that it was the next Highland clearances, that they have promised to work more cooperatively with communities and with the fishing industry. And we wait to see what that comes out to be. And hopefully that's not just words, they really will hope. But what our fear is, they go, okay, we're still committed to 10%. You tell us where you want them. Well, we're not still convinced there's a need for it. That this, as I said before, we're in this speed of change that scientists want something. We're still not sure that there's evidence base of the premise to show that we are in this biodiversity crisis that headlined to be said that we're in. I'm not sure around the waters in Shetland we have this biodiversity crisis. We have 15 years of inshore surveys that say that our stocks are very healthy. We have Richard Attenborough Telma's on programmes on the television, which is filming water under the waters around Shetland, saying that we have a wonderful ecosystem. They need to come and, again, prove it from an evidence base that these measures are required, because ultimately this is in fact impacting on people's livelihoods and their communities. And we need fishing. Seafood is a third of our economy in our islands, of an island of 23,000 people. A third of our economy relies on that, and therefore anything that impacts that, we're going to have a strong voice in Shetland, and therefore we need to have a strong evidence base to show that it's required. That's not gone away. We're not naive enough to think it has.
It'll be interesting to see what the government will propose. It could be more of the same, as you say, it's same wolf in a different sheep's clothing. What would you hope would be the best outcome if this does have to go ahead?
I think that we hope that one of the best outcomes would be the strengthening of the existing MPA network, because that's the real issue that we have. The MPA network has been something that the fishing industry has worked closely with the government for many years, and there's a lot of measures that still haven't been put in place but have been agreed upon by the fishing sector and with the government. So it would be really good if actually we could start there and fix what we're already working on, instead of just bringing a whole host of new areas.
And for us in Shetland, it's just where it's proven to be required, we'll work with the government to do that, but it must have an evidence base. We already have huge numbers of voluntary closed areas that's been identified for fishing to have what's called priority marine features in it, for example. These areas are already closed because fishermen are responsible, and that's why it's important to work with us. Our fishermen, people that dive around our areas, around the waters here, understand what's on the seabed rather than looking at a piece of paper on a map and making assumptions that that's there. And that's what we've seen recently in the latest management measures that they're trying to apply in some of the MPAs around Shetland. Is we know it's not there because we've done our own seabed surveys. The industry shouldn't have to pay for this, providing this evidence to counterbalance a policy that's coming at us. It should be evidence-based in the first place. And that's where real success will happen, is where there's a proper partnership between government and industry to work together for sensible management measures in fishing.
Well, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today. It's been very educational, and we'll look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you very much.